Ninja Sex Party, a comedy band centered around the wild misadventures of Danny Sexbang and his murderous best friend, Ninja Brian. A band that is beloved by many, and one that I've even mentioned on this channel before as one of my favorite musical artists. With 7 original albums, 4 cover albums, 67 music videos, and plenty of collaborations, tours, and much more to come, they've done more in 15 years than most bands do in their entire career. Truth be told, I'm just a huge fan of Dan Avidan and his work. This man has been part of 5 bands: The Northern Hues, Sky Hill, Ninja Sex Party, Starbomb, and Shadow Academy. 6 if you count his collaborations with the Super Guitar Bros as its own band. He just has an amazing voice with incredible range. I'll listen to songs where he vocalizes in the backgrounds over and over again because it just sounds so heavenly. On top of that, he's also the co-host of Game Grumps. With all this stuff under his belt, it's no wonder why he's loved by so many. And I can't forget about Brian Wecht, aka Ninja Brian, who is not only an integral part of NSP, but also has his own kids band, Go Banana Go, and his jazz persona, Très Magnifique. And of course, he's also part of Starbomb and Game Grumps, just like Dan. He also has a PhD in theoretical physics, which makes him significantly cooler than the rest of us. Now, NSP started making music and related videos in 2009. I was introduced to them in 2013, but I didn't really start listening until 2016 when their first cover album released. I've been hooked ever since. They got me connected to Twerp, who I love and have seen in concert multiple times, and my wife and I finally got to see NSP and Twerp together live with their Pure Elegance tour in Columbus, Ohio. What a great concert, man. I got the hoodie. You can see it. It says Ninja Sex Party, Pure Elegance tour. It's pretty cool. There's like diamonds on the sleeve. Hang on, there we go. There's like diamonds on the sleeve, and you got, the typical whatever on the back. It's dope. It's so cool. And so that brings me to my current hyperfixation. The timeline! What started as just a conversation between my wife and I about how she imagined a couple of the songs were connected in one way or another absolutely blew up into me trying to piece together each and every track across their entire discography, excluding the remasters and the live album. And while I'm positive that there was no real plan for connected lore between all the different tracks, music videos, and promotional material, especially since there are a couple continuity errors which we'll have to work through, I don't give a crap. I'm about to game theory this. I'm like Matt Pat doing pixel measurements in the back of a Buc-ee's hyperfixating instead of doing my homework. Kids, make sure you do your homework. With all that said, I want to make a couple things clear before we dive in. Number 1, there's going to be a lot of assumptions and leaps in logic. I've tried to make everything flow logically as best as I can, but when you have something that was made with no real concerns for continuity, you have to use what you have and connect the dots as best as you can. We also have to assume that in this universe, absurd and fantasy elements are normal. Number 2, the music videos take precedence over the songs. Now, some of the songs are given extra context when made into a video and completely change what you would conclude the song to be about. We have to take it case by case since some music videos have artistic interpretations, but generally, we can accept the visuals to be true, which means that Dan's physical age and appearance in the videos does not matter, nor does the actual release order of the songs, albums, or videos. And finally, number 3, this is about the characters, Danny Sexbang and Ninja Brian, not the band itself. This isn't a documentary about how Dan Avidan and Brian Wecht met and created NSP. Rather, it's about the characters that they play in the songs and their timeline. And just to be clear, for our purposes, the story is told in the medium of song and music video. With this in mind, the songs more so describe the events that take place rather than showing Dan literally singing a song to someone in public or, in the privacy of his own home, although that does happen. Some of the songs are actually songs, but I will get to those and let you know what they are when we get there. Make sense? All right, there's a lot to go through, so I'm going to stop talking and get right into it. There are several eras that I've divided Dan's life into: ancient times, childhood, superpowers, band beginnings, Cool Patrol, Twerp, seeking purpose, and settling down. They do overlap a little bit, and the songs in each era don't necessarily fall exactly where I have placed them, either because they take place over a period of time, or there isn't enough evidence to solidly place a song in one place or another. I've grouped songs together that I am confident have strong connections. That said, let's get started with Ancient Times. In medieval times, where dragons, wizards, and magic are abundant, our story begins close to the end of the 12th century with Daniel Sexbang and Ninja Brian wandering the wilderness where they come across a mermaid. Enchanted by her beauty, he attempts to woo her in the best way he knows how, with pizza. It doesn't pan out, and he ends up very injured. Saved by Ninja Brian and the nearby kingdom, Daniel pledges his loyalty to the king and serves as one of his knights, becoming Sir Daniel Sexbang. It's around this time that he and Princess Headshot, yes, that is her real canon name, become romantically involved before Sir Daniel is sent on a quest across the sea. There isn't any real indication of what this quest was beyond just defeating the evil across the land. In the video, he fights lions and gladiators in a coliseum and zombies in a graveyard before he returns to his princess. The song is written from the perspective of a letter that he writes to her, and in it, he promises to return and make her his queen, which nicely leads into our next song. Much time has passed, and Sir Daniel Sexbang has married Princess Headshot and assumed the position of king, connecting us directly into Release the Kraken. Due to the difference in castles we see in the background of the video, we can assume that the kingdom was relocated to this new land after cleansing it of evil. Now, it's possible they settled in Wangtown or New Jersey due to their proximity to the ocean. However, I would like to draw your attention to this part of the map by Wangtown. Here you can see a tower resting by the sea where a river meets the ocean. While we never see this river in the music video, we can assume that it's there, just always out of view. More importantly, the shoreline on this map matches up with the shoreline of where the castle should be in the video, on this peninsula right here. Okay, so we figured out where this new castle is, but why does that even matter? In Release the Kraken, the enemies of the kingdom are also coming from the north. And what's up north from them? Attitude City and New Jersey. Lands that Sir Daniel would have previously conquered, as seen on the map where the line stops next to Attitude City, not far from New Jersey. Unfortunately, all the evil that he spent his knighthood conquering has risen up to destroy what peace he has built. In order to combat this uprising, King Danny declares it time to release the Kraken! Now, it's a small detail, but we see the Kraken is chained up under the sea. Even for a seafaring people, a feat like this would be nigh impossible. Impossible, that is, without the help of a navy composed of ninjas and pirates led by Ninja Brian. With what we know about Ninja Brian, he is one of the few people who has the power to take on a creature such as the Kraken. Although based on the behavior of the Kraken, he might have just come willingly. It's likely that when Sir Daniel first sailed to this land, that they ran into the Kraken, and Brian was able to subdue it. This led to Brian being placed in charge of the Navy in order to watch over it and keep it under control. Now, this may have also been part of the reason they moved to this land in the first place. The Kraken was their power move if they were ever invaded by the evils that resided there. And we all know how that turned out. The following battle is one of the wildest and most interesting parts lore-wise. Release the Kraken has some of the most connections to the greater timeline as it stands. However, I want to reveal those as we get to their main places in the timeline. What I will mention, however, is that we can confirm that King Danny, Ninja Brian, and the Kraken survived the battle. What we don't know is how other people fare, but we know that the ancestors of Aaron, Ross, and Susie are all seen in the kingdom, and it's very likely that if they didn't survive, their offspring definitely did. In any case, either King Danny himself or his descendants slowly made their way into the land of New Jersey and settled down. About 400 years passed, and that's where we meet our main characters, Danny Sexbang and Ninja Brian. This marks the start of the childhood era. Now it's time for me to show my hand. Go back with me to the tall skyscrapers of ancient Japan to the year 1100 AD, where two great warriors, a dude and a man, proclaimed no sex until you are married, namely Aaron Neverbone and Samurai Barry. That's right, Samurai Abstinence Patrol is technically the very first entry in the timeline based on this timestamp in the music video. However, the only reason I didn't put it first was because Dan is nowhere to be seen at that time. Only Aaron and Barry. Now we can surmise that at some point in the following 100 years, at least one of Aaron's descendants or relatives traveled to Dan's kingdom and served in his army. But that's just a minor detail. Surely not everyone in Aaron's family was so staunchly against boning. The lyrics of Samurai Abstinence Patrol describe that from the time that Aaron and Barry existed, 500 years later, two heroes were born. They were Ninja Sex Party. So if they existed at 1100 AD, then that means that Dan and Brian were born in 1600 AD. We have to assume then that technology in this universe has advanced significantly faster than it did in our world, especially if they had tall skyscrapers in ancient Japan in 1100 AD. We also know that Danny and Brian were born at the same time, in the same place, because of the song Behind the Mask, which will pop up in the timeline later. Dan sings that he and Ninja Brian have known each other since they were both babies. Now that we know the year and have an idea of how this universe functions, let's jump back to the present. Danny Sexbang is a child living with his parents in the suburbs of New York, New York, as evidenced here in The Decision, where his parents have just bought him his first pet, a python. For some reason. Dan, being young and naive, leaves this cage open because they use the honor system, and the python gets out and causes a ton of chaos. Who would have seen that coming? Having lost his very best friend in the world, his parents get him something much better, a hamster. Dan knows that his python is still out there wreaking havoc, and they need a hero to save the galaxy. So he invites his friend Ninja Brian over from his home in Tokyo, New Jersey, also evidenced in The Decision, and they take it upon themselves to train the hamster. I like to think that Brian wasn't born so much as he just kind of popped into existence through his pure hatred and desire to kill, but that's something that's completely different. Now we know for a fact that Galaxy Hamster's mission was to defeat the python because of the lyric, the fates of the goldfish and snakes had aligned, united by a common foe. We even see Galaxy Hamster fight a snake, a robot snake granted, but still representative of how Danny feels about his previous pet python. At the end of the day, they're just kids playing in this song, so we can confidently say that most of the song takes place in their imagination. Fast forward a bit, and Danny is now in high school, where he's part of a sports team in the song Sports Anthem. Danny is feeling an immense pressure to perform, especially in front of a crowd. We aren't sure what sport it is, but I get the vibe that it's basketball. Dan's a pretty tall and handsome and tall guy. Of course, Danny fails in front of everyone and loses the game. Not sure where Ninja Brian is in this time frame, but I like to imagine he's the one encouraging the crowd to sing the song to Danny. This is a devastating blow to his confidence and self-esteem. After costing his team the game, he begins to be bullied in class. Danny is at his absolute lowest, until he's visited by himself from much later in his life. This is the first instance of Danny Don't You Know, where future Danny brings Finn Wolfhard, high school Danny, on a journey of self-discovery. It's important to mention that this is where Danny first meets Twerp, which kind of creates a strange bootstrap paradox, but I'll get into that later. After seeing who he is and who he becomes, his confidence skyrockets. High school Danny is able to stand up against the bullies and pursue his dreams no matter what. At this point though, Dan has already quit playing sports due to his embarrassment, but he returns with a vengeance. Being a band kid himself, he unites the marching band in his school to create the song that he calls GFY, wherein he tells everyone on the sports team who bullied him to GFY. An effective stunt that solidifies his confidence for the rest of his life. Except in one tiny little area. Breaking into young adulthood has been great for Danny. He's meeting girls, getting invited to parties, and making friends. He's still a bit inexperienced and not exactly the hottest or coolest guy around, but his absurdly high confidence and genuine nature gets him pretty far. We don't know for sure if he's had any girlfriends in high school, but we know at the very least from Danny Don't You Know that at the time he was still a virgin and he will be for a while. Since this is said by future Danny to younger Danny, we know this takes place at least several years later. Whatever the case, it's at this point that Danny is romantically involved with a girl in 3 Minutes of Ecstasy, Sarah Kaufman. This is an awkward time for Danny, as he finds he can only last for 3 minutes, hence the title. His confidence has been shaken, and he feels afraid to face his girlfriend for longer than their intimacy lasts. This does not deter him. Instead of facing his shortcomings, pun intended, Danny uses his confidence as a shield and makes excuses as to why he chooses to only last for 3 minutes. Your safety is my main concern. I gotta go to the pudding store for pudding. Not more than 4 times a month. That would be ridiculous. Essentially saying that sex with him is so good that any longer than 3 minutes would be a disaster. It's Danny's greatest shame, but it's his only defense against this insecurity. Sadly, Sarah seems more weirded out and slightly uncomfortable throughout the video, and this issue would be the eventual ending of their relationship. We now close Dan's childhood and move on to the linchpin of the timeline, superpowers, particularly thunder and lightning. While putting together this timeline, I initially went through to determine if I thought each song was something that actually happened, or if it was just a story Dan was telling to get with a girl or to seem cool or something. That way, I would be able to focus on the stories that were real and fill in the fake ones pretty much wherever I wanted. On my first pass, I assumed a large portion of the songs were just tall tales or fun stories written by the band. So when I came across Thunder and Lightning, I was expecting it to be fake. Either by the way it was told or by some other indicator from the video or lyrics, I figured there would be something that would ultimately suggest that it was fake. Instead, all I found were more lore implications. The song begins with the line, "When I was just a young man," indicating that he's at least between 18 and 25-ish. And it continues with the story of how Danny got struck by lightning in the junk and woke up the next morning with superpowers from God. He then gets a costume and uses his powers to fight crime. But Ben, I hear you saying over there, doesn't he get beaten up by a gang and nearly dies because he didn't actually have powers? Yes, you're right, you remember the song correctly. But what happens immediately after that? He says an ancient prayer and gets powers from God. And if Dan actually got powers from God, then that means that every single magical or unexplainable thing that takes place in the songs now has an explanation. Does Danny make something randomly appear out of thin air? God powers. Does Danny teleport into people's houses at will? God powers. Does Ninja Brian kill Danny at the end of a song? No, he doesn't. God powers. Danny is now effectively immortal and able to make anything he wishes real, whether he is truly aware of it or not. He has a tendency to not use his powers to their maximum potential, but what else do you expect from a guy whose last name is Sexbang? Now reeling from the massive amount of power now coursing through his vein, Dan stumbles home and crashes, where he starts to experience vivid dreams about being a superhero, one that rides for justice on a comet of stars. One part unicorn, one part wizard. By the end, Danny's mom, played by Rachel Wecht, wakes up Danny from his slumber. It's clear that she has a very low tolerance for Dan's antics, especially given that he's in his 20s and still lives at home. I imagine Ninja Brian always hanging around doesn't help his case either. Now remember that Dan and Brian have been together since they were both babies. Throughout their childhood, Brian had taught Dan in the ways of the ninja. But after all this time, it's clear that Dan does not have near the same physical prowess as Brian. He simply doesn't possess the murderous nature needed to follow in Brian's footsteps. Despite all of his training, Dan no longer wishes to pursue the ways of the ninja and realizes his true calling: dance. And maybe music. One thing I'd like to point out is that in the music video to I Just Wanna Dance, Dan is seen with pictures from 1978, 1986, and 1994. And he also mentions killing a king and changing the course of European history. Bold claims, especially when you consider what we've already established lore-wise. Surely Dan couldn't have done all this so quickly while he was mortal, and definitely not immediately after he gained his powers. I would suggest that these photos were given to present Danny by future Danny when he visited in Danny Don't You Know. After all, future Danny can time travel, and he definitely would have gone to the 80s and 90s. So in this song, Dan is not singing about himself, but he's singing about his future self and what he has done, and what present Danny will do sometime in the future when he becomes future Danny. Confused yet? Don't worry, this is all just a very long and convoluted way to fill a very minor plot hole. Also, Europe is now called Ninja Town. Just thought you should know that. With all of Dan's musical talent from his time in high school and Brian's ability to do literally anything, they forge Ninja Sex Party, and the journey of the greatest band ever has begun with the NSP theme song. As days go by and Danny gets used to his new abilities, he finds himself feeling more aroused more often. But even when he isn't, he still finds himself getting hard in the most awkward situations. He dubs them no reason boners. He may not know the reason, but we do. This phenomenon increases daily up to the point where he feels the need to announce them. In Everybody Shut Up, I Have an Erection, it only happens 87 times a day. He literally demands that everyone stop what they're doing and witness penis perfection. Which, to be fair, if his junk has been blessed by God, that's probably true. Despite this, people are still put off by public nudity, and when Danny interrupts a presidential speech, he gets shot to death by the Secret Service. Except, because of his powers, he survives. Here we take a break from his developing powers and take a closer look at the band. We can assume that everything from Dan learning about his powers to writing and producing songs takes place over the course of several weeks to years, depending on the context. Of course, these events can overlap, but we can assume that they happen very closely to the order that I've put them in. After writing the NSP theme song, Dan and Brian decide that they need a dubstep song to really give their band a strong start, since all the kids are listening to it. Dan doesn't know what dubstep is, and Brian makes sure to reinforce this by making the least dubstep song ever. Next, Dan writes Symphony in P minor to really diversify his audience and keep the sex in Ninja Sex Party. It's at this point that Dan realizes what he needs to make the band truly successful. Get a manager. Despite only having 3 songs to their name, it's what all real bands do, and it's the only path to success. So they call up this guy named Brent, literally don't know where he came from, don't ask. I didn't fill the lore in for this, and asked him to be their manager. He reluctantly agrees. I mean, how bad could it be, right? They only have 3 songs and some semblance of talent, and he probably won't have to put in too much work. He suggests that NSP starts writing death metal music since their music is not current enough for the kids. And Dan says, heck yeah, you got it. Dan doesn't know what metal is, and Brian makes sure to reinforce this by making the least death metal song ever. They performed in the metal festival with other bands, which really shows them what metal truly is. And while this certainly put NSP on people's radar, they were still too new of a band to have much of a following. Surprised at how different the music really is to what Dan thought it was, they spend the next 3.5 years working on the most intense metal song of all time. Brent, being a manager, has lots of connections. And lucky for NSP, the local hospital for sick children is absolutely desperate for a band to perform for them. Either whoever was in charge of planning this event didn't do their job, or maybe Brian killed the previous band. Either way, NSP is the only band they can get on this short of notice. So they write Butt Sex Goldilocks, since they need more songs to add to their set list. Believe it or not, their performance actually gets them some extra attention and notoriety. During all of this, Dan's parents are pressuring him to do something with his life. They don't believe that his band is going to take off, and they suggest that he go to college or get a job or something. Being a ninja doesn't count. At the moment, Dan is ludicrously single, so he agrees to try to do one or the other. Why not both? He goes to a local college where he and Brian kill the professor and take over the class. They teach them about the true history of dinosaurs and lasers and aliens and how Albert Einstein invented space. And through it all, Dan actually meets and connects with a girl who's played by Julie Katz. She's pretty important, so we'll be seeing her again real soon. Right now. It's right now. We're seeing her again right now. Having briefly met and connected with her, Danny and Brian venture to her home, where they attempt to convince her to make the decision to have sex with one or the other. Throughout their time talking themselves up, both Danny and Brian show off some of their uncanny abilities. Danny does so absent-mindedly, not even aware that he's defying death and logic. In a desperate bid to make himself the better choice, he declares that Ninja Brian has an STD, which absolutely stokes the fires of his wrath. Brian ruthlessly murders Danny in a fit of rage, but because of his powers, he survives. Neither of them get with Julie in any romantic way, but she and Dan remain friends. Somehow. This is one of those points where I'm like, it's absurd and it doesn't make any sense. This is one of those. Danny simply moved on to the next girl. But Brian had other plans. Now, Brian had always planned to kill Dan eventually. He had planned to kill everyone on Earth eventually. And in space. But Dan was special somehow. Maybe it was because of their common heritage with King Danny and Ninja Brian back in ancient times. Maybe it was because Dan was a good musician. Maybe their friendship was truly genuine. Whatever it was, Brian was going to save Dan for last. Yet despite his intense rage, he didn't kill Danny. In fact, there have been multiple occasions where Dan should have died, but didn't. Which means that Brian is now faced with something that insults his very reason to exist. A big white stain on the blood-soaked t-shirt of his life. This increased his anger tenfold. From this day on, Brian vowed that he would find a way to kill Danny. And if he can't kill Danny, he will get revenge in other ways. Fast forward to the day of Dan's birthday party, Brian has meticulously planned his revenge. If he can't kill Danny, he's going to kill all his friends. After all, Brian was going to kill them all anyway, and what better day to ruin Dan's life than on the day of his birth? But things don't always go as planned. Dan is frustratingly go with the flow, and as it turns out, even though Brian has killed well over 50,000 people, Dan simply can't stay mad at him and declares that they are best friends forever. As charming as this is, Brian is unshaking in his motivations. Now you're probably asking, why doesn't Brian also kill the girls that Dan is currently into? That would ruin his day more than anything. I was wondering the same thing. In every song and music video, Brian has never once killed the main girl. After some thought though, I believe there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, it's not hard to believe that Brian is also interested in girls. He's seen stealing several girls from Dan in Dragon Slayer and First Date. Not to mention, the decision in The Decision was about who Julie was going to pick to have sex with. Meaning Dan and Brian were both competing for her. It's likely that Brian sees an opportunity to affect the girls in one way or another by either stealing them from Danny or by scaring them away with all the murder that he commits. Either of which would hurt Danny more than just straight up murdering them. At first, Dan's immortality was a serious problem for Ninja Brian, one that needed to be solved. His white whale. But then he realized, Danny is the perfect person to be around, someone he can kill over and over and over again to forever satisfy his bloodlust. All he needed to do was make sure that Danny never got tired of him and kept him around. So the girls are off limits as long as they are prospective dates, and Brian will make damn sure that he is the best bandmate and wingman there ever was. But if there's a chance to test if Danny can die, he's gonna let it happen. And have some sadistic fun along the way. The girl from Best Friends Forever would not last forever. And so Dan does what he always does. Takes it in stride and keep moving forward. And Brian does what he always does. Follows Dan and kills everyone around him. This has become so normal that Dan makes a point to explain Ninja Brian to girls that he's with. The entirety of Party of Three is an example of this. Dan simultaneously flirts with a girl while also filling her in on Brian's antics. In typical Danny luck, she isn't cool with murder in the second degree and a ninja staring at us 3 inches from your face. To her credit though, she did stick around for all of Ninja Brian's murders up until the last one where he tried to kill Danny again. And to his disappointment, Danny lived yet again. As we can see, this whole time, Danny has been striking out multiple times in a row. His luck with girls hasn't been the best, and his junk powers are causing his arousal levels to increase more and more each day. Dan needs to find some sort of release. He needs to get the side effects of these new powers under control. He's made moves on nearly every girl he's found attractive and has found no luck whatsoever. Partially because of Brian, but even Dan can be a bit forward at times. So he turns to the one person who hasn't failed him yet, which also isn't true, the girl played by Julie Katz. By the point in the song Next to You, several years have passed between now and The Decision, as the song starts with, "We've been friends for many years." Dan confesses his love to Julie, hoping to make more of a real relationship than his previous attempt in The Decision. But Julie draws a hard line and deeply friend-zones Danny. He's sad for a little while, but takes it like a champ and responds in the only way he knows how, by jacking off everywhere, all the time. This is one of the music videos we have to take with a grain of salt. We see Dan doing all these different things with Julie where he's jacking off, but we also need to remember that this video, he's writing in his jerkin journal. This could be taken as him writing about what he could/would do for her, whether he shares this with her or not, or we can take it as these events happened and he's writing about them after the fact. Personally, I prefer a mix of the two because most of them are plausible, and since he has god powers, he technically could make any of this happen. I will point out, however, that when he writes about the zombie apocalypse, Ninja Brian dies to the zombies, which is totally unrealistic and something that Dan would definitely say happens, even though we know that it is literally impossible. In any case, this relationship basically ends here. We see that Dan's mom was at Julie's b-day party where Dan smashed the cake. Yet another reason for her to be vastly disappointed in him, but why stop there? Despite all the jacking that Dan is doing, it's just a band-aid solution. He decides to cast his net as wide as possible and advertise the Ninja Sex Party sex training courses in a newspaper. Ideally, he will spread word about his band while also offering to help those who need it. It's free after all, who could resist? We only know of 2 confirmed cases of the sex training advertisement working, but it seemed to get a very positive response from those involved.
Oh, my girlfriends tried it. They said it's totally worth doing.
We can assume that there was at least one more instance of this, as we see Dan with another girl in The Ultimate Sandwich. Here, we see Dan read a story about the Ultimate Sandwich, but in truth, it's him describing how far his powers have gone. They've begun changing his desires so much that he has now surpassed the need for women. He now needs to have sex with food, which is a desire that doesn't leave him for most of his life. Only the parts with him in the bedroom happened in real life, since the rest of it is just the story. In his blind arousal, he bangs Brian's blueberry muffins, inducing rage and causing Brian to slice Dan in half with a sword. Dan survives. The girl left a long time ago. Even with all the setbacks, Ninja Sex Party is gaining fame, going so far as to be asked to host a panel at the Tokyo, New Jersey Super Convention Dome. More specifically, they were asked to host the annual Women's Appreciation Buffet. It was not well planned, as Danny was only thinking of how he can use this situation to get more ladies. After all, there would be a ton in attendance. Surely one of them would respond well to his message, "You can do us." None of them did. In fact, both the girl played by Julie Katz and Danny's mom were in the crowd, who left significantly more disturbed than they've ever been. And this would end up being the last straw for Dan's mom, and she would kick Dan out of the house. Homeless, jobless, and still horny, Dan moves in with his girlfriend. What girlfriend, you may ask? Oh, he just got another one. You really shouldn't be surprised at this point. I don't think I need to explain it each time. He meets a lot of girls somehow, and somehow he ends up dating them. Anyway, since he knows so much about being a ninja despite just wanting to dance, he also gets a job as a karate instructor. Now, during this time, NSP has been writing songs. More specifically, they've been trying to write metal music. Danny and Brian spend all their time researching and studying the evil involved in writing the most intense metal songs ever. They create shredded metal and cookies during this time, which are moderately successful attempts. Over the course of the last year, Dan's urges have only increased, and he reveals to his girlfriend on the anniversary that he smashed all her things. Put your mind back in the gutter, you know exactly what I mean. She is rightfully disgusted and kicks him out. But it's no big deal. Because of his job as a karate instructor, he can afford an apartment now in the notoriously dangerous Attitude City. Wow, it's like Attitude City has this reputation that dates all the way back to the ancient times and Release the Kraken. He uses his job as a karate instructor to flirt with all the moms by talking about mom stuff, like saving the earth from pollution. Dan's apartment in Attitude City strangely looks like a dojo from the outside, but on the inside is actually an incredibly small studio apartment where he and Brian live together. In the Sacred Chalice, Dan invites another girl who he met from Dinosaur Laser Fight to his place. Now, I could explain the entirety of the events in this 4-part saga, but it all turns out to be a fake story and the girl leaves and yeah. Although I will point out that even though that the chalice Dan had was fake, the chalice itself was very real. We see it in multiple videos in the background, but the most important being Release the Kraken, where King Danny is holding it right at the beginning. So Danny and Ninja Brian now live together in this tiny studio apartment alone. With their work as NSP now reaching the public eye, people come up to them and say, "Hey, Danny Sexbang and Ninja Brian, you guys wear a lot of spandex and live together. Are you gay?" Which leads to Danny calling Ninja Brian gay and Danny getting thrown off a cliff. Typical best friend stuff. The biggest takeaway from this song is the confirmation that Danny and Ninja Brian live together. Now, since Dan and Brian were studying how to make the most intense metal song of all time, they did a lot of research on demons and metal music and evil and that kind of stuff. Slowly, as they studied and practiced, they've been able to make more and more progress towards this goal. During their studies, they came across an ancient text describing a terrifying creature known as the Manticore. This creature from old and ancient Greece was a most ferocious beast and caused terrible mayhem. Dan and Brian originally summoned him to help write metal music, which they tested on the girl played by Sarah Kaufman, but he goes wild and becomes unstoppable, heeding only his own agenda. Although, it wasn't just random chance that the Manticore ran off to ruin lives. I will draw your attention back to Release the Kraken, where he was summoned to fight against King Danny, which means this rivalry goes back generations, despite modern Danny not really being aware of it. I'll also add that Sarah was dating another guy in the song, but the Manticore kills him and also steals her from him anyway, so no big deal, I guess. Danny had no shot with her regardless, is the point. At some point after this, Danny was probably invited to a party where he meets and tries to flirt with a girl there. Ninja Brian wingmans as best he can, and Danny pulls out all of the stops, claiming he won the Super Bowl all by himself, cured all diseases, can lift a continental shelf, and is a dragon slayer. All things that he definitely could do with his powers, but chooses not to. Ultimately, she sees through his incredible story and partnership with what looks like another descendant of Aaron Egoraptor Hansen, who himself appears to be homeless, and chooses the football player, and the scientist, and apparently the weightlifter as well, and the dragon, and Ninja Brian, and the Manticore, who wasn't even in that song. It would seem their rivalry is far from over. I placed FYI I want to F your A here in the timeline since not a lot happens in it. I think it's just another example of Dan flirting with a girl in a very specific way and then being rejected by the end of it, no matter how into it the girl seemed throughout the video. In this song, we see Danny teleport everyone a couple of times and create totally fabricated environments while he's using a very sophisticated language, one that he will be developing over time. Either way, nothing too crazy or lore breaking here. But that concludes the band beginnings section of the timeline, and the mashup with the superpowers era. The rest of the timeline is much cleaner from here on out. But we've been going on for a while, so let's take a short intermission. To get back in the swing of things, we need to establish some connected lore as we enter the next era on the timeline, Cool Patrol. At this point, Dan and Brian already live in Attitude City, and in that time, they've befriended Aaron and several other guys who live there. We also know that Attitude City is riddled with rampant crime, and only the toughest can survive. With Dan's immortality and Brianness, they gather more and more members together to form the Cool Patrol gang and take over the city. In a way, getting revenge for his ancestor, King Danny, for the ruin that was brought upon his kingdom all those years ago. This is where Attitude City takes place, with Dan acting tough to protect his newest bone interest, played by Emily Roche. Although, he may have come off a little strong. So he follows her and meets her at a little diner in town where he shows off how sensitive he truly is by explaining why he cries. Plenty of power usage in this song, and I assume it works because I placed Accept My Shaft next simply because the song doesn't have a video and therefore the girl could be anybody. So I choose her. Then I guess Smooth Talkin' comes next, where Danny explains to Ninja Brian how he talks to women. This is similar to FYI I Wanna F Your A, as it's another type of coded language that Dan uses to flirt. He has refined it a bit, but it doesn't really work. It could be the same girl who gave Dan a chance, but after the song, she's no longer interested. Now comes the titular Cool Patrol, where we get to see the gang in action once again. Attitude City was where we briefly saw how the gang acted, but Cool Patrol is where we see the truth of who they are and what they stand for. Dan and the gang are chilling at a roller rink when they spot Jacksepticeye, a high schooler. A high schooler getting pushed around. So he decides that it's a job for the Cool Patrol. We see that the whimsical nature of the gang hasn't changed since Attitude City, and the way they suggest that this kid fights back against the bullies is to do the Cool Patrol dance. which probably actually works for Dan in certain situations given his powers, such as flight and throwing cars and setting fire to Mars. Unfortunately, not everyone is blessed with Dan's God-given powers, and Jack gets his head beat in. And in case anyone doubted me, we know that the gang in Attitude City and Cool Patrol is the same because number one, why the heck would Dan be in multiple gangs over his lifetime? Number two, his sunglasses in Cool Patrol say Rawk fuck, which is exactly what they say at the end of Attitude City. So take that. Although, I will give credit to the fact that Dan's entourage changed between the songs, but there could be a ton of reasons for why that is. At least Dan and Ninja Brian stay the same. That's gotta count for something. Come on, guys. In any case, this kid gets absolutely beaten, and in response, Dan asks if they can move in with him as thanks for their services. He reluctantly agrees for some reason, and we know this because they clearly live with him in the beginning of the Mystic Crystal. However, we should note that this takes place in New Jersey because the song explicitly states that right now they're in New Jersey. This is important because it would be around this time that Dan got fired from his job as a karate instructor for flirting with all the moms that came to pick up their kids. So now he can't afford the studio apartment in Attitude City. Now, I have no reason to doubt that everything in this song happens, even though we see impossible things like Markiplier being evil and Ross being a wizard. You might be wondering why it didn't include this song in ancient times era, since this is clearly a medieval setting. And there are two reasons. Number one, this is very clearly modern Dan and Brian who get warped into the past to help. Second, this is a completely separate timeline/universe than the main one. We all know this because the king tells his wizards to search through time and all realities, and Dan remarks that they got sucked through 26 dimensions of space and time. So, yeah. Proved. I will admit that it is a bit strange to put Cool Patrol and the Mystic Crystal so close together in the timeline, given that in Cool Patrol, Jack is described as a high schooler, and in the Mystic Crystal, he obviously lives in an apartment with Danny and Brian. It's weird for everyone involved, I admit. I just want you to know, I have thought about it. All I can say is, Danny is not that good at judging age, or Jack had just graduated or something. I don't know, man. He clearly doesn't care about Danny and Brian at all, given how he reacts to them being warped away and setting his couch on fire. It would only get worse from here. Regardless, this is their life now. Danny and Brian pay rent with offers of karate lessons, sex training, or band lessons, and remind Jack of how they saved him from those bullies, and they left their gang back in Attitude City so they could move to New Jersey and live with him and protect him and mentor him. Oh, the sacrifices they made! Jack avoids them whenever possible. It's been about 24, maybe even 48 minutes since Dan last looked upon the princess from the Mystic Crystal that he saved, and he's ready to get slamming. So what's a guy like Dan to do except call every woman he knows and invite them to an orgy? They don't call him Sex Bang for nothing, because it's his last name. About 10 or so girls actually respond and show up, and a mime for some reason. And you guessed it, this is where Samurai Abstinence Patrol officially happens. During the orgy, Dan is able to release all his pent-up energy to the point where he thrusts so hard, he rips a hole in space-time. This, of course, is where the Samurai Abstinence Patrol jumps through to the future and they have an epic battle, which the song describes in pretty good detail. Too bad they lost the battle and were voted most douchey in a recent poll. But this wouldn't be the end. From this point on, dramatic ripples have been made and will be felt far, far into the future. Aaron and Barry are now aware of a distant, looming threat to everything that they believe in, and they must plan accordingly. If you're a hardcore NSP fan, then you know where this is going. But we'll get to that later. With this orgy ruined and in shambles, Dan needs a redo. So he invited all the girls back again the next day. Unfortunately, due to how awful their experience was because of the Samurai Abstinence Patrol, they all come up with ridiculous excuses for why they can't come. And of course, Steve was not invited because he was a guy. Down, but not out, Dan decides he can have fun anyway and has an orgy for one. Yet another reason for Jack to feel so apathetic towards his roommates. Some more time passes, and the 69th annual boning convention comes to town, and they request NSP and Steel Panther to be the headliners, both due to their music, but also due to their boning adventures known almost worldwide. When they finally meet up, Danny tells the tale of his boning road trip over the past year, which is unfortunately false, given that Danny dies at the end of it. We could argue that it happened and that he died but survived due to his powers, but it's clear from the video that the intention is that the story isn't true. Steel Panther also didn't have a great story to tell, and thus the convention came and went without much fuss. But Dan, now coming to the realization that his powers can do more for him than just keep him from dying, he decides that he wants to make that story that he made up come true. But we have to take a small detour before we tackle that. Road Trip marks the end of the Cool Patrol era, and we now step into the Twerp era. Now I have to mention that even though some of the songs in the timeline up to this point have had Twerp's involvement in the writing or performing of the songs, we have to assume through this timeline that any songs that take place before the two bands meet didn't have Twerp involved in their creation. The only solid evidence for Twerp being involved is if they appear in the music video or if Dr. Sung has a vocal part. I hate that it has to be this way because I want to give Twerp all the credit that they deserve because they deserve a lot of it. But as far as this timeline and the evidence goes, that's just how it goes. It's out of my hands. I'm sorry. During their time living with Jack, Danny and Brian have been making big moves in the music space. NSP is growing in popularity as a band, and people really want to collaborate with them. The dragon from Dragon Slayer is Aaron Egoraptor Hansen in this universe, and NSP has helped him get back on his feet with the Cool Patrol. In fact, Aaron does a lot more than just appear in a couple of music videos. As I was putting this timeline together, I wanted to include everything that NSP was involved in. After all, there could be more evidence to flesh out the timeline. Plus, what kind of timeline theory would it be if I didn't look into every single minuscule detail no matter how minor they appeared to be? Originally, I was just putting my focus on songs that NSP collaborated on, figuring those definitely counted. But then I realized Ninja Sex Party is mentioned by name within the songs made by Starbomb. Starbomb isn't just a band created by Dan Avidan and Aaron Hansen, it is a joint band between Ninja Sex Party and Egoraptor, and later Twerp as well. In their very first song, I Choose You to Die, Aaron starts the song with Egoraptor, Ninja Sex Party, gotta catch 'em all. Smell my balls. And yeah, I admit that since NSP is a band in the real world, that this could be just that, the real band. But the fact of the matter is, in all the art and all the music videos that they appear in physically, it's Danny Sexbang and Ninja Brian. Most of the time they're playing a different character in the songs, but the few times where they do appear as just themselves, it's always Danny and Ninja Brian in character. Which means that whenever Brian actually speaks on the album, it's a new character. Brian Wecht is a different person than Ninja Brian. It makes sense. Hush. On top of that, if Starbomb is a real band in this universe that Dan collaborated on, then that means that Game Grumps is a real thing that Dan became part of, since Dream Daddy, a dad dating skit, is a track that exists on the Triforce, which is the third album by Starbomb, where they mention Game Grumps by name. Do I seem insane to you yet? I've been working on this for months. I put way too much thought and effort into this video. I know that people will likely disagree with me here, and honestly, I'm not too attached to this part of the theory, but it was something I had considered and needed to be put out there. I wouldn't even be upset if the whole Starbomb thing being canon wasn't widely accepted. It's a spin-off theory at best and doesn't hold a ton of weight lore-wise. But for the sake of the timeline, I will say that the first two Starbomb albums, Starbomb and Player Select, were created next. I'm also going to say that this era is where all of NSP's collabs happen. This, like previous eras, has some overlap with other eras. These collaborations with other bands obviously didn't happen one after the other, but I'm putting them all here because this is where NSP as a band really starts to hit its stride. We've got Dick Figures, the movie, the song with Mondo Media, Zombie Handjob with Wackula, and Self Care Sunday with Flula. There's also a cover of My Own Worst Enemy with Nate Wants to Battle, but the YouTube video credits Dan Avidan, while Spotify credits NSP. Dan is not in costume in the video, and Ninja Brian doesn't show up, so I'm not counting it. But otherwise, congrats! You all now exist in the Sex Party-verse. Isn't it everything you ever wanted? We're now at the point where Dan has used his powers to build a time machine and spaceship in Jack's garage, and the events of 6969 take place. Specifically, the original version. I'll get into what I think about the Level Up album later. Danny and Brian travel to the year 6969 to see what the world is like in its sexiest year. And as it would turn out, the world isn't sexy at all. It's been taken over by the Dick Elders, a council of evil anti-sex dictators who have taken over the world and now control it. There's more lore to this, but again, I have to hold off until later in the timeline. I'm sorry, but bear with me here. We see that the council is led by none other than a figure who looks insanely close to Aaron Hansen, as well as Barry, Ross, and Kevin. Yes, you heard that right. Two descendants of the original Samurai Abstinence Patrol are on the council of Dick Elders. Far, far into the future, their plans have finally taken shape, and their schemes have gone to their extremes. At least the original Samurai Abstinence Patrol only believed in no sex until you are married. But this evolution after their defeat at the hands of NSP has led them to deny sex and human touch completely in order to maintain control. And this has been going on for 1,000 years, as stated by Dick Elder Aaron. If people have sex, they'll break a 1,000-year spell. So they actually took control in the year 5969 with some kind of magic spell. I mean, if I was called the most douchey in a recent poll, I'd probably do the same thing. Valid crash out. And if you aren't quite convinced, how else would Dick Elder Aaron immediately recognize Ninja Sex Party unless they were previously warned about them? The Samurai Abstinence Patrol must have informed their future followers about NSP and their time-traveling abilities within the sacred scrolls that they passed their tale down in. Well, 6969 continues as it does in the song, and Dan finds the girl with the sad eyes and the beautiful blonde hair and falls immediately in love. She's actually a descendant of the girl he was with in Attitude City, and that's why he was immediately attached to her. Yeah, this is some weird Back to the Future stuff, but hey, I'm just putting the theory together, man. So they have sex through Dan's irresistible, attractive nature, and they're able to start a global-wide orgy that defeats the Dick Elders. Brian finishes them off, and the Empire falls, leaving Danny and Brian to return to the present, having now completed their quest. Shortly after, Dan runs into Twerp while they are out exploring space to find the grooviest planets in the galaxy. Twerp sees that NSP's groove potential is off the charts, and they become fast friends, jamming out as they journey across space and time. They visit the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, kill a king, and change the course of European history, which is now known as Ninja Town. And around this time, they meet the president of space, who answers all the questions about space they could have ever asked. Like, did Albert Einstein really invent space? What was it like during the dinosaur laser fight? Can puppies survive in space? To which the answers come as you'd expect. And Dan writes puppies in space because now he knows they can't survive. Returning to present Earth, Dan wants to celebrate saving the world by having a party. One that conveniently has been foretold by the scrolls to be thrown once every 100,000 years by NSP. And it turns out to be a really terrible party. So much so that Ninja Brian explodes the building with his mind, effectively destroying their living space and any semblance of tolerance that Jack had left for them. So, with their tails between their legs, they return to Dan's parents' house to crash until they can get back up on their feet. But what else is a single man to do when his future girl is waiting for him in the year 6969? He picks one up at the club, of course. Ninja Brian absolutely slays the wingman role and probably killed the bartender to do it. Dan and this girl hit it off, so the next logical step is to take her to a place where they can be alone. Unless his mom and dad are home. Welcome to my parents' house is next, and Dan's parents are not too keen about having Dan back in their home again after everything he had done. But he is their son, and they want what's best for him, so they reluctantly let him stay. But their tolerance for his antics is next to none. Towards the end of the song, Brian summons Twerp through the TV purely through vibes alone, and they decide to stay and join forces to create some of the greatest jams of all time. Baby NYC and Built for Love are created, and Dan asks Twerp to join Starbomb for their third album, The Triforce. Starbomb finally created Starbomb Boom, Rise of Lyrics, and it came time for NSP and Twerp to go on tour together. NSP has gained a ton of fame through their collaborations and new music that they now have a big enough audience to take it across the country. This leads to the events of Get Ready to Get Ready and the creation of all 4 of the Under the Covers volumes. Of course, this doesn't happen immediately after each other, but this is generally the order that all this happens in, just like in previous eras. Twerp makes a strange request, however. They want to borrow Dan's time machine and spaceship to explore time and space some more. They journey around for a bit, revisiting their own time again, and even traveling far back into the ancient days where they find King Danny defending his kingdom in Release the Kraken. They save him from the Manticore, and return to Danny once again with a fun story to tell. The tour that NSP and Twerp went on dramatically increased their popularity, and they were invited onto a TV show where they got to perform the No Pants Dance live. Another display of Dan's charismatic powers, where the crew on the film set start dancing and the woman who was watching them on TV actually warps through the TV just like Twerp did before. It's another crazy circumstance and solidifies NSP's career as a band. Dan is absolutely riding this high. He's famous, he's made friends and money, he can get all the ladies he could ever want, but he suddenly remembers someone that he long forgot about. Someone who really shaped his whole life. Himself. He remembers how he felt as a child and how hopeless his life seemed at one point until he was given the world's greatest pep talk by none other than himself. It was time for him to return the favor to himself. By this point, with his experience with magic and time machines and mystic space portals, Dan had gained the ability to travel through time without the need for a dedicated time machine. So he writes Danny Don't You Know, gathers Ninja Brian and Twerp, travels back in time to when young Danny was in high school, and gives him the motivational speech of a lifetime. No! No! Oh my gosh! It was all coming together! I have been working on this for months! How could I have missed this? How could you do this to me? It was perfect! Everything was fun! And it was okay! Oh my god. Screw it! This part is not canon. This is real Danny singing to his real younger self, played by real Finn Wolfhard. You wanna know what the worst part is? The script is already done. Yeah. I was just gaining footage for the video. This is a real crash out after the fact, okay? The script's done, okay? You know how many times I had to redo this timeline? I would start writing about a song, and then, I pull up the music video and the lyrics just to be a good boy, and do my due diligence, right? Check on things, make sure everything lines up, make sure I'm not pulling crap out of my ass. And then I noticed one tiny little detail, the smallest little detail that ruined everything I had written up to that point, and then I would have to start over. Is this even worth it? Okay, look. We've come this far, so let's just keep going and pretend that singular date is not real. This is outside of the character, okay? This is when real Dan was in high school. This has nothing to do with the plot, okay? Okay. So, he gives young Danny the photos that he got in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and tells him all about the future and who he is and who he will become. It feels great to do and gives Dan the satisfaction to know that he has made someone much more confident and secure in themselves, even if it was himself. And now we close another chapter of Dan's life and enter the next one, Seeking Purpose. Dan has done so many things with his life, achieving just about everything he has ever dreamed of. But for some reason, despite loving what he does, he feels like he's missing something. Whether it's an early midlife crisis, a desire to branch out, or the oppressive force of a sociopathic ninja constantly looking over his shoulder, it's unclear. In any case, this is the era where Dan goes through some maturing and experiments with different things. Like usual, the girl from Welcome to My Parents' House doesn't last, and Dan is forced to move on. But tonight is the night that he's taking his latest girl on their first date, and he needs to make a great first impression. He takes advice from Ninja Brian and chooses to take her on an adventure to break some rules, sneaking into a movie, breaking into private property, general stuff. But Dan knows that he has to show this girl just how much of a bad boy that he is. After all, he did once lead the toughest gang in the toughest city. He shows off some skills that Ninja Brian taught him years ago and starts committing crimes. She's put off by this at first, but Dan is so sweet, buying her flowers and coffee, holding her hand, and talking about their families, that she begins to be enamored with the duo. They go out and steal cars, art from an art museum, and even murder 5 guys. As the night progresses, they commit more and more crimes, but as she gets a taste for danger, she begins to fall for the one who is the most dangerous of all, Ninja Brian. Fortunately, Dan comes out of this whole ordeal owning his own car that he stole. Truthfully, Dan doesn't know that much about cars, but it automatically makes him cool, and he has to go show it off to everyone, even Twerp, who were able to guess pretty quickly that he owns a car. While the car itself makes him pretty cool, what makes him even more cool is the fact that he doesn't wear seatbelts. They're for losers. They're a scam. And so 1980s. Honestly, I can't blame him. I mean, what use does an immortal have for seatbelts anyway? Now that Dan is super cool, he uses his car to do what anyone with a car really truly wants to do. Take Ninja Brian to soccer practice. Brian kills everyone there, including Dan, and Dan survives again and reminds Brian why he's so angry. At some point, Dan uses all the money he's earned from being in a band to buy a house, and maybe a car that's actually good. He and Ninja Brian were just chilling at their place when they get a frantic call from the president of space. Turns out Rhinoceratops and Super Puma are both on Earth and are wreaking havoc. NSP is the only hope to save billions of lives, but Dan's making baked potatoes, and he's about to add the chives. It's going to take them at least an hour to get there if they really try. So in the meantime, let's get into the lore. We learned some interesting things from the music video. For example, Rhinoceratops and Super Puma have both invaded Earth multiple times across history. Both the lyrics and the video support this, with the line "mortal enemies since the early days of yore," and the video showing Super Puma invading Earth during multiple different years, namely 5000 BC, 1200 AD, and 2013 AD, officially making this clip the earliest point in the timeline. I'm sorry I lied to you again, but I had to do it. So if you're paying attention, talking to you, Doug, then you'll remember that our current timeline places modern Danny and Ninja Brian at around 1600 AD, and King Danny at somewhere near the end of the 12th century, so 1151 plus AD. And crazy enough, this whole thing fits within the timeline. If we take yet another look at the music video for Release the Kraken, you can look into the crowd of invading enemies and see among them Rhinoceratops and Super Puma. And since we know that they were on Earth at 1200 AD, where we see a castle and a knight in the background, we can confidently say that the battle in Release the Kraken has to take place during that same year. Unfortunately, we don't get to see them do anything in this song beyond their brief cameo, but at the very least, we know that they caused some kind of mayhem despite appearing to be on the same side of the conflict. Maybe they put their differences aside to fight Danny, or they were just fighting each other amongst the larger battle. Either way, this solidifies just about every other part of the timeline. We can also confidently say that even though NSP saved the world from super monsters, they at least returned to kill Justin Bieber in 2013, which I think is pretty funny. The rest of the song continues as usual. Danny and Brian return and put on an amazing rock show that causes Rhinoceratops and Super Puma to fall into a love trance and return to space. Brian stabs a random guy, Danny gets laid twice in a row, and everybody returns home as society starts to rebuild, knowing that NSP is not only a great rock band, but also great heroes. After the great night that he had with the two girls after the concert, Dan tries to reach out to one of them to go on a second date. Unfortunately, she's already with another guy, and Dan begins wondering tonight who she's with now. He's sad, but not for long. Now, Dan kept in contact with the other girl from Rhinoceratops vs. Super Puma, and one day he visits her for a steamy date night, but before they can get to lovin', she's gotta put her kid to bed. No problem at all, Danny is great with kids. Like any other potential stepfather would, he writes a gentle bedtime lullaby for the child and goes with Ninja Brian to perform it. This song is an epic metal song that finally brings together all the elements that NSP has been trying to incorporate for years. They have mastered the study of demons and are able to summon an army to help perform and rock this child to sleep. Twerp even shows up to amp the song up to an 11 by flying jets overhead that transform into a Voltron robot and cut the house in half. Needless to say, this pretty much only works once before the relationship ends, yet again leaving Danny wondering if it was the guitar solo, or maybe the demons. As he patiently contemplated this and wondered if maybe it was his musical talent, he turned to something that he had been patiently working on for the past 16 years. His romance novel, Claudia Goes to Schlongtown. It's a deeply sensual tale despite Ninja Brian's distaste for Dan's literary expertise. It looks like the novel's going to take at least another 16 years before its completion. So while we wait for that, Dan finds another lady to be with. They may have only been together for 3 days by this point, but Dan knows how to treat a lady right. By eating food in the shower. There's not a lot of lore here, except that Dan just dates another girl and still kinda has a hard-on for food, like the sandwich from before. It would seem that good old Dan hasn't changed even after all this time. After stuffing the girl's shower with strangers and ruining the few meals they've had together, the relationship ends, leaving Dan lonely and wanting more than this. How many times will he connect with a girl only for it to end like this? But Dan hasn't given up. This isn't the end. It's been 10 years since he tried to get together with Julie Katz, and now it's time for him to try again, but this time with all the extra confidence, musical talent, and maturity that he has gained over the years. And the best way for him to do that is to use the same song as before, but just make it better, and tell Julie all the cool things that he has done between now and then. And of course, remind her that Brian has an STD, in an even more epic fashion than before. Brian once again attempts to get his revenge through his unbridled rage, and of course, Danny lives. It occurs to Danny that over the course of their friendship, Brian has tried to kill him many times. Not only that, but Danny hasn't exactly been the best friend to Brian all the time, calling him fat, stupid, ugly, STD-ridden, dick, stupid, ugly again, and generally giving him the short end of the stick. And while Brian certainly has done his fair share of mean things to Danny, such as stabbing, beating, slamming, choking, cleaving, and stealing his girls, he's always remained by his side, rocking out and writing tasty jams, going on whatever stupid adventure that Danny has gotten sucked into, and even fighting side by side with Danny through many dangers. If you can't stab your best friend 1 minute and then help him write a tasty jam to attract a girl the next, are you even friends? So after publicly stating that Ninja Brian has an STD and erectile dysfunction for well over a decade now, Danny feels like he owes him one, and agrees to sing on the lead track of his new children's album. Well, sort of. The song is very Ninja Brian, and Dan doesn't want to lend his voice to something so depressing. So instead, he decides that he will write his own song about his best friend in the whole world. Behind the Mask is all about the relationship that they have together, and how Ninja Brian is more than just a silent murder machine. He's an artist and a scholar, but most importantly, he's a friend. This leads to a huge change in Dan's life, where he really starts to give all the respect and appreciation that Brian deserves. And so, last but not least, we have finally entered the final era of Dan's life, settling down. Dan has achieved much in his life. Money, fame, girls, adventures, friends. He's even branched out and tried other things, like leading a gang, committing crimes, writing romance novels, and becoming a space and time traveler. Everything finally comes to a head here, at the end of the timeline, and Dan finally finds what he'd been looking for his entire life. At this point in Dan's life, he's still trying to date girls, but he's matured enough to the point where he no longer tries to win them by talking about how cool he is or by jacking off ceaselessly. Now he has experience, he has class. Wherever he met this girl, he decided that he would do the tried and true method of taking her to dinner and just having a good conversation. No sexual pretense whatsoever. But Dan now faces a serious issue. All these years of using his powers from God to keep himself alive, beating death time and time again, and manipulating the world around him to do the impossible, has finally begun to take a toll on his body and his mind. He should have seen this coming all the way back when his sexual urges began to be satisfied. When did that start happening again? He can't remember. In fact, he can't focus at all. He doesn't know what they're talking about. Both the video and the lyrics together support this. The lyrics to the song say, "But I was lost inside your oceanic eyes. Our hands touched briefly as the light reflected off your golden hair." Which is fine if you're just listening to the song, but the video very explicitly shows that this girl has both brown eyes and brown hair. This isn't the only example of this either. When he says, "Now it's 10 o'clock and the meal is done," there's a shot of a clock, and guess what? It's freaking 12:15-ish. It's way past 10 o'clock, bud. Unless for some reason the hands are flipped, which would mean that it's actually 3 o'clock. But that can't be the case, because then it would be bright outside at the beginning of the song, and it wouldn't be dinner, it would be a late lunch. But wait, there's more. Here's a deep cut for you. What if I told you that Lamar was not just a figment of Dan's imagination, but he became real through Dan's waning grip on his powers and his sanity? You're not ready for this. If you like NSP and you want more information, you can sign up for their mailing list where they'll send you updates on new merch and music and tours and albums and pretty much everything that you'd want to know about NSP. Well, I've been a part of the mailing list from the very beginning, and it's exactly what you'd expect, except for one tiny detail. At the bottom of every email, there'll be a section called Lamar's Lamentations, and below that, there's a little section where they'll have like a quote from Danny or Brian or someone else. From the very first email, Lamar has this to say: "Thanks for subscribing to my list. I would like to thank my new employers, Danny Sexbang and Ninja Brian, for enabling me to quit night school and keep my nursing job." Lamar is a real pterodactyl who was a real nurse who was hired to do the mailing list for NSP. Dan used his powers to accidentally create Lamar because he was so stressed about a situation that he made up in his head. Do I look insane to you yet? You have no idea how deep I've delved into this. And while I'm here, I'll point out everything else that happens because of his powers too. The Dracula's become real. He would make an awesome cop if he could stop committing crimes, but he's been committing crimes his whole life, so why stop now? And penguins in costumes are very cute, and there should be more of them. All this to say, he's losing his mind, and I think that it's really cool that this little fancy restaurant had Twerp and Ninja Brian come play the live music. My first job was at a fancy French bistro restaurant, and I would have killed to have Twerp come play live there. Anyway, this date clearly doesn't end well, and Dan is forced to move on. So he returns to his mansion that he bought with all the money that he made from NSP. He meets a girl who lives nearby and wins her over with his charm and flattering words. They hit it off, and soon they are together in Dan's mansion. But not far off, a group of 3 rough-looking motorcycling individuals ride with a list of names in their hand. They show up at Dan's place and beat him up and kidnap him, leaving his new girl to gear up and reach out to Dan's friends to save him. We see her travel far and wide to reach Twerp as they work on their own side quests. Dr. Sung is helping fix a satellite, Commander Meowch is teaching guitar to his kin, and Lord Phobos is absolutely shredding on top of a volcano, and Half Hogan has been hidden in an ice cave until the time is right. They gather together, find the hidden lair of the motorcycle men, and rock their faces off. Now you're probably wondering, where's Ninja Brian in all this? Well, after saving Danny, we hear a toilet flush, and out of the bathroom emerges Ninja Brian, staring menacingly. Genuinely not sure what to make of this, but I see 2 paths. Either Brian was already about to save Danny, but decided to take a restroom break right before he did it, or Brian put out the hit on Danny himself. Oh, that's why it's called The Hit. I just got that. Time passes, and Danny has even more money from his music career, causing him to buy an even larger mansion and have crazy, extravagant mansion parties. They usually get out of hand and get a lot of people hurt or even killed at times, but the parties really do rock and the panda fights go crazy. But just like how his powers are fading, so too are his desires to party. Despite party being in the name, Dan is reaching the point where he can no longer handle the wild antics of a party. From the most terrible to the very best, Dan has seen it all, and he's beginning to enjoy the simpler things in life, like quiet evenings and not waking up with a hangover. But one day, his friends in town invite him to one last party. Dan is ready. He's excited. He loves parties, right? Not anymore. This final party solidifies his opinions of parties and Dance Till You Stop with the line, "I forgot to mention, I hate parties every time I give them a try." Similarly to I Don't Know What We're Talking About, Dan's slipping powers are causing him to change. He's less confident, slightly less horny, and more anxious. Even when he does make a connection with Tom Cardy, he chooses to never talk to him again afterwards. It's a tough time where Dan is unsure what his purpose is and where his identity lies. Fate would be on Dan's side as one day while he's at the malt shop, he meets not just any girl, but the girl. Dan has gotten pretty shy in his age, having faced plenty of rejection, and feeling as though his life is missing something. But she initiated and approached him, wanting his nut heat. Throughout the lyrics of the song, it's revealed that it's been 5 years and they got married. And through it all, she had an unquenchable thirst for his hot nut heat. Dan has finally found a girl whose sex drive matches his own, and they lived happily ever after. Of course, during that 5-year period, Dan would sing Heartboner to her, and the description of the girl in Nut Heat pretty closely matches the girl we see in the music video for Heartboner. Hair was golden curls, and boy was she pretty. We also see a lot of Ninja Brian trying to get in the way and interrupt the song, but Dan actually stands up for himself and gently pushes Brian away. I don't think this is indicative of their friendship fading, but rather I see it as Dan making sure that Brian doesn't mess this one up in any way. And Brian is at the point where he knows that nothing he can do will kill Danny or mess this relationship up. Their love is real and pure, and Dan has finally found what he's been looking for after all these years of flirting. While Dan has found something good to hold on to, the world would start to take a turn for the worse. We all know that things have been getting pretty bad since Let's Save the Earth, but it wasn't taken super seriously. And now we know that the Samurai Abstinence Patrol have evil plans that won't reach their full potential until 5969. But one thing we can be sure of, that in between it all, the Samurai Abstinence Patrol are building toward world domination. Dan invites Brian to travel with him to find the Wishing Bear so that Dan can wish for world peace and fix what has been broken. But we know that they don't find the Wishing Bear, and Dan gets mauled without Brian's help. Luckily for Dan, his powers have saved him once again, but who knows how many times he has left before that part of his powers also disappears. Brian, in all his ninja wisdom, has been unable to truly kill Danny after over a decade of trying different methods. His friendship with Dan has been very positive and fruitful, allowing him to murder hundreds of thousands of people and create genuinely good music. But Ninja Brian can only stand next to the person who represents the antithesis of his existence for so long, which is why Brian makes the difficult decision to join Twerp as they travel across the galaxy, saving planets, fighting for justice, ending tyranny. Out among the stars, Twerp is known as the Starlight Brigade, and they are legendary for their ability to turn a battle around from certain defeat to uncontested victory, traveling from beyond the most distant star to save anyone in need. Brian finds solace in the work that he does here, and Twerp welcomes him with open arms. His ninja powers would definitely come in handy, and we see them in action in the music video for Starlight Brigade. Meanwhile on Earth, Danny has settled down with his wife. Not only that, but he has perfected his secret language that he uses on his lovers. It used to be FYI I wanna F your A, then it evolved into smooth talking, and now it has been perfected with Dig Ol' Bick. Dan's relationship with his wife is also full of romance, which we know Dan is very capable of. He writes Do Math With You as a love song, which also reveals that his wife is a theoretical physicist with a master's degree in applied mathematics. And I'm sure that they do a lot of math together. As the world gets a bit darker and more uncertain, Dan's powers have now all but faded into the world. Many years have passed and he is at peace with his wife and a great career behind him. But he sees that the world is on the brink of total war. Knowing that everything he has done so far, there is one more thing he can do to save the world. The boner of peace. With the last drops of the god powers that remain, he uses it to nudge the president's hands off the nuclear controls and sow the seeds of healing and erect a flag of kindness. The world is better off once again, thanks to Danny Sexbang. But as we already know, the good times don't always last, and while we aren't certain about the fates of Danny or Brian or Twerp or anyone else for that matter, we know for certain that despite the evil that comes from the Samurai Abstinence Patrol, the world is saved once again in 6969. But such a great defeat would cause the Dick Elders themselves to make plans and strike back. Now the final key in connecting all the pieces together is held within Nut Heat. The Nut Heat in question is the power that Danny had in his loins that he received from God. This entire time, he was fueled by Nut Heat, and every time he used his powers, he left a little Nut Heat behind, until he was fully drained of his powers at the end of his life. It's what made him so attractive and appealing to ladies. So 300,000 years into the future, just like the song describes, the age of mankind has ended, and the age of machines has begun. Factions of artificial intelligence are fighting over the few remaining natural resources still on Earth, which itself has not been saved. Sorry, Danny and Timmy's mom. There's a last battalion of human resistance fighters who are living underground and all have but one energy source remaining. Nut Heat. Danny Sexbang, Ninja Brian, Ninja Sex Party, Twerp, the Cool Patrol, the Manticore, and every girl that Dan has been with have all long passed. But Dan's influence and his presence is still felt through the Nut Heat that he left behind all those years ago. And the artificial intelligences that war on the surface come from a long line of evil groups and councils that lead all the way back to the Dick Elders, and even before them, the Samurai Abstinence Patrol. Throughout the rest of time and space, the war between sex and anti-sex rages, leaving destruction in its wake. But mankind still has a chance, all thanks to Danny Sexbang and his nut heat that he gifted to the universe. And that concludes the timeline. If you're still watching at this point, thank you so much. Genuinely, this was such a fun and stupid and goofy project that is taking me way too long to do. But I'm glad it's finally out, and I'm very proud of what I've put together. I just want to thank Dan Avedon and Brian Wecht, all the members of Twerp and Starbomb, and everyone who helped them as well for creating such awesome music that has genuinely influenced my life and brought me so much laughter and joy. I love seeing what you guys make and going to your concerts, and I can't wait to see what you all create next. From the bottom of my heart, you guys rock. Now to cover some loose threads real quick. Originally, I had theorized that there was a split in the timeline where adult Danny goes back in time and talks to his younger self, which would lead to the events of the Level Up album happening instead of their original counterparts. But I liked the idea more that it was one big loop, and I think it works better this way for younger Danny to gain his confidence through his older self in a sort of bootstrap paradox. As for all the albums that I didn't include, such as Level Up, The Master Strokes, the very classy acoustic album, and any other songs or tracks like the introductions and outroductions, the reasoning was that they were more in line with the real-world NSP than the in-universe timeline NSP. For example, Master Strokes is just the same songs, but remastered. The acoustic album is just that, a live acoustic performance of their songs, where I would argue that Dan is out of character. And finally, Level Up, I was just unable to find a place for it. I suppose it could be argued that these are albums the band's in-universe produced, which would make them all fall into the same era of the timeline, that being Cool Patrol or Twerp. This video is going to be way too long, so I hand it over to you, the community. What do you think about the timeline? Was I on the money or was I way off the ball? Do you think that some tracks could be moved and placed somewhere else? Like, seriously, if you have any questions about my placements, I will try to explain myself in the comments as best I can. And if you find a major plot hole or error within my theory, please let me know and tell me how you would fix it. Again, hugest thanks to everyone who watched this and to the awesome community that I got to interact with at the concert. You guys are the best. I'm gonna go rest now. Keep doing stuff, and I will see you in the next video.